Monster Hunter World Iceborne is a wonderful gaming experience with a whole host of content that Capcom has supported over the past few years, but now we have access to all the game has to offer, so we can now work towards the best of the best builds in the game. So I'm Darcblade with some of the best builds for the Chargeblade in Monster Hunter World Iceborne. Now when I say best of the best build, I mean a build that is constructed from some of the rarest armor, weaponry and jewels in the game. This gives hunters some of the strongest sets possible. For this series, I'll be featuring 4 builds for the various weapons, which should cater to a variety of playstyles. When it comes to the Chargeblade, it's a Swiss army knife of a weapon, combining standard DPS aspects, defensive aspects thanks to the shield, fixed damage aspects thanks to the whole file bursts. It allows for a variety of builds and ways to play and use the weapon. So the first build is the best of the best raw attack build. This build is all about increasing the weapon's raw attack as well as the damage we can do through our files. On top of that, we have a lot of options, so we've got a ton of quality of life and defensive skills to add to this build. So for this you'll need the Dragon Head Beta, the Dragon Hide Beta, Brachydium Braces Alpha, the Dragon Barbs Beta and the Dragon Feet Beta. I'm also using a Challenger Charm 5, and for my weapon I'm using the True Fatalis Charger. This has an attack increase augmentation and then a health regen augmentation. As for the specialist tools, these are down to personal preference, so I've gone for a Temporal and Rocksteady Mantle for defensive purposes. So when it comes to the jewels, you've got a lot to play around with, but a lot of these are optional. So the main mandatory ones you want to take first is the Magazine Jewel for the capacity boost, Artillery Jewels for the artillery skill, Attack Jewels to max out attack boost, Charger Jewels for the focus skill, Tenderizer Jewels for the weakness exploit skill, Flawless Jewels for peak performance, Iron War Jewel to give us a point in the guard skill, Evasion Jewels to max out the evade window skill, Shield Jewel for the guard up skill, Expert Jewel for a point in the critical eye skill, Protection Jewels for divine blessing, and finally I've gone for a Fortitude Jewel for the fortify skill. As for the jewels and the specialist tools, these are down to personal preference again, so I've gone for Iron War Jewels to give us a few more points in the guard skill. So if you've done what I've done here, you'll have a build with 200 health and 200 stamina. This will be 200 regardless of if we've taken out all our relevant consumables. You have a raw attack of 1372 with a little bit of purple sharpness. You have no affinity, although this potentially can be 70% when you take into account weakness exploit as well as the buff that you get from the agitator skill. You have dragon rating of 150, which is very low, but to be honest we're focusing on raw attack, so even though we're a dragon weapon, you can use this build and weapon against any monster, even if they are resistant to the dragon element. You have high Elder Seal, which makes it useful against elder dragons, and you'll have impact files. You'll also have a decent defense of 1111 that is strong against water and thunder, but unfortunately weak to the other elements, especially dragon. Now when it comes to the skills, first of all you'll have attack boost at level 7. This is a skill that increases the raw attack of a build, and at level 4 or above it will give us a bonus 5% affinity. You have agitator at level 7, which is a buff that kicks in whenever a monster becomes enraged. When a monster becomes enraged, you'll gain increased raw attack as well as bonus affinity. And as it's easy to control when a monster becomes enraged in Iceborne, thanks to the whole flint shot mechanic, this buff should be active for the majority of a hunt. You have artillery level 5, which increases the damage of our file bursts. Artillery combined with increased raw attack means that our file bursts will be dealing the most amount of damage that they can possibly deal, and as the damage from our files deal fixed damage regardless of a monster's elemental or element resistances or even hit zones, it means that we can deal a decent amount of damage to a monster regardless of where we're hitting it. You have Evade Window at level 5, which is a useful defensive skill. Evade Window is a skill that increases the invulnerability frames when we perform dodges and hops and such, so it gives us a chance at rolling through attacks. We'll also have Divine Blessing at level 5, which is another defensive skill. This gives us a chance at taking reduced damage where we take a hit from a monster. However, this doesn't guarantee that we'll take reduced damage, so it's still risky. Nonetheless, at level 5, there's a high chance that we'll take reduced damage should we fail to evade a monster's attack or even block it and take the hit. You'll also have Stun Resistance at level 3, which is a useful quality of life skill that nullifies all stun effects on our hunter. Sometimes when it comes to Monster Hunter World and Monster Hunter World Iceborne, most feints occur after a hunter has been stunned, but with Stun Resistance it completely nullifies that risk. Next up is Critical Eye at level 3, which is a skill that increases the base affinity of a build. This is very useful as the true Fatalis Charger comes with negative affinity. This critical eye at level 3 combined with the attack boost cancels out the negative affinity of the weapon. Next up is Weakness Exploit level 3, which is a useful skill when it comes to DPS. Weakness Exploit is a skill that increases our affinity whenever we're attacking monster weak points, and should these weak points be tenderized through Clutch Claw attacks first, this increase to our affinity is even greater. Weakness Exploit at level 3 can potentially provide us an extra 50% affinity. Next up is Focus at level 3. Focus is a skill that is useful for the Charge Blade as it allows us to charge up our files quicker, allowing us to deal more file orientated attacks such as the super amped elemental discharge. Next up is Peak Performance at level 3, which is a skill that increases our raw attack so long as we have full health. This is a risky skill to use, but when you're more adept at avoiding damage, this can be useful adding to our overall DPS. Next up is Fortify level 1, which is a quality of life skill really. Basically, it's useful for difficult hunts. Whenever you faint and come back, you'll come back with increased raw attack and defense. Next up is Capacity Boost level 1, which is an essential skill for the Charge Blade as it increases the amount of files we can have. Normally, Charge Blade builds come with 5 files, but with the Capacity Boost, we'll be able to have 6. This will allow us to use more file orientated attacks, such as when we're in Savage Axe mode, or allow our super amped elemental discharges. It will also allow our shield to remain charged up for longer as well. Next up is Guard at level 1, which can be potentially level 3 when we're wearing our mantles. Guard at level 1 is kind of a quality of life skill for the Charge Blade. Guard is a skill that reduces the knockback when we block an attack from a monster, as well as the stamina used to block that said attack. With the Charge Blade, when we have a charged shield, having Guard at level 1 means that we can block most monster attacks and follow it up with a Guard reaction. Without Guard at level 1, this reduces the amount of monsters we can actually do this against. And then finally you have Guard up level 1, which again is an optional defensive skill that allows us to block unblockable attacks. So those are the skills, but now let's move on to the set bonuses. We'll have 2 of them, both attached to the Fatalis Legend. For wearing 2 pieces of the Fatalis armor, we'll get the Inheritance set bonus. This is a set bonus that removes the skill level cap for certain skills in your build. Basically, if you have a skill in your build that could be raised through a certain set bonus secret, say for example Agitator Secret, then you have the option to raise that said skill. So for example, in the build we're using here, we have pretty much Agitator Secret, Artillery Secret, and Divine Blessing Secret. And for wearing 4 pieces of the armor, we'll have the Transcendence set bonus. This is a skill that grants you, well, 2 set bonuses really. First of all, it allows your health and stamina to be raised to their maximum of 200 at the start of a hunt or even after fainting. So it means we don't have to use the likes of health boost or stamina cap up. On top of that, it also grants us the True Razor Sharp skill for the Charge Blade, which reduces our overall sharpness loss, allowing us to keep that purple sharpness for longer. So there we have it, that is the best of the best raw attack build for the Charge Blade. It is one of the strongest and most versatile builds for the Charge Blade in all honesty, and even if you didn't want to focus on raw attack in your file bursts, you could replace some of the raw attack skills with skills to increase your affinity if you so desire. But even the best of the best builds have pros and cons. When it comes to this raw attack Charge Blade build, its biggest pro is its raw damage output. Having access to one of the highest raw attack damage values in the game, it means that our attacks are going to be hitting hard. This combined with the artillery skill also means that our file bursts are also going to be dealing a decent amount of damage regardless of a monster's resistances. On top of that, this build has quite a few defensive and quality of life skills. Thanks to Evade Window, Divine Blessing and more, it all makes the hunt feel a little bit more easier than it is. And finally, when it comes to the pros, this build has access to both the Fatalis Legend set bonuses, so it has Inheritance and Transcendence, which are very powerful set bonuses that increases a build's DPS, defensive and obviously quality of life. But every build has cons, even the best of the best. When it comes to this build, its biggest con is it only has a sliver of purple sharpness, and even with the Transcendence True Razor Sharp, there's a chance that we may fall down into white sharpness. And the other con, which you'll find on a lot of these best of the best builds, is that unfortunately you need a lot of rare jewels for this build to work. But regardless, if you have access to this build as well as the jewels involved in it, you're going to have a very powerful build, able to take on pretty much any monster in the game effectively, comfortably and quite quickly. Which brings us on to the next best of the best Charge Blade build, which is the Elemental best of the best Charge Blade build. This build features one of the strongest elemental Charge Blade builds we can have in the game, so it can effectively take on monsters so long as you're utilising elemental weaknesses. So for this build you'll need the Sappy Crested Crown Beta, the Sappy Crested Chest Beta, Sappy Crested Van Braces Beta, Sappy Crested Belt Beta, and the Sappy Crested Boots Beta. I'm also using a Frost Charm 5, as we are using an ice weapon. You can of course replace the Frost Charm 5 to match whatever other element you are using, if you were to use a weapon with a different said element. And for my weapon I'm using the Kia Strong Arm Ice. Pretty much with this build you can use any Kia weapon, just remember to replace the Frost Charm to match whatever new element you are using. The Kia Strong Arm Ice also has an elemental up augmentation as well as a health regen augmentation. As for the specialist tools, again they're down to personal preference, so again I've gone for the temporal and rocksteady mantles. So when it comes to the jewels, you've got a few to play around with. First of all, I've gone for a Frost Jewel to max out the ice attack skill of this build. Of course, if you were using a different weapon with a different element, you would replace the Frost Jewel to match whatever new element you were using. I've then gone for Charger Jewels for the focus skill, Vitality Jewels for health boost, a Resistor Jewel to max out the blight resistance skill, this is pretty much optional, a Hard Enduring Jewel for the item prolonger skill, a Sharp Jewel for protective polish, Magazine Jewel for the capacity boost skill, Tenderizer Jewels for weakness exploit, Evasion Jewels for the evade window skill, an Iron War Jewel to give us a point in the guard skill, and finally a Sated Jewel for the free meal skill. As for the jewels and the mantles, I've gone for attack jewels and protection jewels. So if you've done what I've done here, you have a build with 150 health, 100 stamina, which will be 200 health and 150 stamina when you're on a hunt and taking all your relevant consumables. You have a raw attack of 1066 with white sharpness. You have 60% base affinity. This can easily be 100% when you take into account weakness exploit. Remember, this base affinity of 60% is taken with the True Dragon Vein Awakening buff in effect. You have an Ice Elemental rating of 1140. Again, this elemental rating is taken with the True Dragon Vein Awakening buff in effect. And you'll have Power Element Files. You also have an OK defense of 1081 that is strong against every element except for the Dragon element. So when it comes to the skills, first of all you have Ice Attack at level 6. This is a skill that increases the elemental rating of your build so long as you're using an ice weapon. Of course, if you were using a different weapon that had a different element and thus using a different charm as well as that individual elemental jewel, Ice Attack would be replaced to match whatever new element you were using. When it comes to elemental weapons and elemental builds, always take into account the monster you're going up against. If the monster has a freestyle weakness to that said element, then the elemental builds normally are quite effective against them. On top of that, this build has Evade Window at level 5, it has Health Boost at level 3. Health Boost is a skill that allows our health to get to that maximum of 200. You have Blight Resistance level 3, which is a useful quality of life and defensive skill that negates all elemental blights on our hunter. This is kind of a combination of being built into this build as well as duels. You have Critical Boost level 3, which is a skill that allows us to deal increased damage whenever our attacks crit a monster. And as we easily have 100% affinity, so long as we're going for monster weak points, it means that our hits should be dealing additional damage. However, this additional damage only comes from the raw portion of an attack, not the elemental portion. Anyway, next up is Weakness Exploit at level 3. You'll also have Focus at level 3. You have Item Prolonger at level 3, which is a result of the jewels we're using, the Hard Enduring Jewel to be precise. Item Prolonger is a skill that allows items and buffs to remain in effect for longer. So when we take a Might Pill for example, it will remain active for longer. But we've taken Item Prolonger mainly to use in unison with Protective Polish, but we'll talk about that in a minute. Anyway, next up is Capacity Boost level 1, you'll then have Guard level 1, you'll also have Free Meal level 1, which is a useful quality of life skill that gives us a chance at not consuming a potion or other consumable when we actually use it. You'll also have Protective Polish level 1, which is a decent skill when you have a weapon that only has a small amount of white or purple sharpness. Basically every time you sharpen your weapon, you'll put a protective coating over your sharpness gauge, preventing any sharpness loss for a small duration of time. However, this duration of time is increased thanks to Item Prolonger, which we just talked about. Anyway, next up is Critical Element level 1, which is pretty much like Critical Boost, but for the elemental portion of an attack. So, whenever our attacks crit a monster, we'll be doing increased elemental damage. And then finally, when you're wearing your mantles, you also have Attack Boost at level 2, or Divine Blessing at level 2. So, when it comes to the set bonus, you have one of them, which is linked to the Sappy Tifa Seal, True Dragon Vein Awakening. This is a skill that provides a ton of DPS buffs for simply having your weapon drawn. With your weapon drawn, you'll gain a bonus 40% base affinity, and on top of that you'll gain increased elemental ratings that will lead you to deal more elemental damage. But there is a downside to this. With each swing of your weapon, regardless of if you hit a monster or not, you'll drain a bit of health from your hunter, leaving a small portion of red health on your health bar. This can build up, especially if you keep missing with your attacks, leaving you at risk of carting. However, this health drain isn't all doom and gloom, as if you continuously attack a monster for a set amount of time, the true Dragon Vein Awakening will initiate a heal, healing you for the health it drained. But regardless, this is a strong elemental DPS build with high affinity and more. So long as you're taking into account a monster's elemental weaknesses and you have a selection of elemental weapons to switch between, this is a very effective build. But as always, there are pros and cons. When it comes to the elemental best of the best build for the Chargeblade, its biggest pro is its elemental damage output. Able to bring down monsters incredibly quickly, especially when you're taking into account a monster's elemental weaknesses as well as the Savage Axe playstyle. On top of that, this build has quality of life skills, making the hunt feel a little bit more easier. Evade window, health boost, blight resistance and more, this can all help a hunter when they're on a quest. And finally for the pros is the true Dragon Vein Awakening set bonus, providing you with strong DPS buffs for simply having your weapon drawn. But of course, there are cons to every build. The two biggest cons for this build include the true Dragon Vein Awakening health drain, which can potentially leave you at risk, although this is slightly alleviated thanks to the health regen augmentation. And the other con for this build is unfortunately this build only has a small amount of white sharpness, which you can burn through pretty quickly, even with protective polish and item prolonger. But there we have it, that is the elemental best of the best Chargeblade build. To be honest, when it comes to the best of the best elemental builds, it's normally a tie-up between the Elatrion armor and the Safi Jiva armor. I tend to prefer the Safi Jiva armor as I enjoy the risk reward factor of it compared to the Elatrion armor. However, if you wanted something more defensive, the Elatrion armor may be more beneficial. But regardless, like I said, so long as you're taking into account a monster's elemental weaknesses, this build can burn through them really quickly. I'd also advise having a collection of Kia weapons so you can switch between the various elements to counter whatever monster you're going up against. But that brings us to our next build, which is the best of the best Master's Touch build. Now in all honesty, the third build featured in most weapon videos here is going to be a meme or niche build. Something that's not necessarily going to be the highest DPS or the highest survivability, but just something to play around with or to scratch the itch of a certain playstyle. With this best of the best build, we're going to feature a strong DPS build which makes use of the Master's Touch set bonus. So for this you'll need the Kaiser Crown Beta, the Dragon Hide Beta, the Brachydian Braces Alpha, the Kaiser Coil Beta and the Dragon Feet Beta. I'm also using a Challenger Charm 5, and for my weapon I'm using the Safi Shatter Shield. The awakened abilities on this weapon include 2 sharpness increases, 2 attack increases and Teostra's Technique. It also has a health regen augmentation, affinity increase augmentation, and then a status effect up augmentation. As for the specialist tools, as always they're down to personal preference, so I've gone for a temporal and rocksteady mantle. So when it comes to the jaws, you've got a few to play around with. So we've gone for evasion jaws for the evade window skill, critical jaws for the crit boost skill, vitality jaws for health boost, iron war jaw for a point in the guard skill, expert jaws for the critical eye, tenderizer jaws for weakness exploit, magazine jaw for capacity boost, blast jaw for the blast attack skill, and artillery jaw for the artillery skill. When it comes to the jaws on the specialist tools, again I've gone for the attack jaws and protection jaws. So if you've done what I've done here, you'll have a build with 150 health, 100 stamina, which will be 200 health and 150 stamina when you're on a hunt and taking all your relevant consumables. You have a raw attack of 1098 with a decent chunk of purple sharpness. You have 55% base affinity, which can easily be 100% when you take into account weakness exploit, as well as the agitator buff as well. You have a blast rating of 240 with impact files, and you have an OK defense of 1063 that is strong against fire and thunder, but unfortunately weak to the other elements. So when it comes to the skills, first of all you have critical eye at level 7, you'll then have agitator at level 7, artillery at level 5, evade window at level 5, blast attack at level 4. This will increase the blast rating of a build, so it increases the effectiveness of how quickly we can build up the blast element. You have health boost at level 3, critical boost at level 3, weakness exploit at level 3, latent power at level 1, which is a byproduct of the armor. It's not really needed on this build in all honesty. Latent power is a buff that kicks in whenever you've been fighting a monster for a set amount of time, or you've taken a set amount of damage from that monster. When this happens you'll gain increased affinity as well as reduced stamina consumption. You'll also have capacity boost level 1, guard level 1, and when you're wearing your mantles you'll either have attack boost at level 1 and divine blessing at level 1. Finally for the set bonuses you'll have 2 of them. First of all is the main event, which is Teostra's Technique, Master's Touch, which prevents all sharpness loss on our weapon so long as we crit a monster. and as we can easily maintain that 100% affinity, it means that we should see next to no sharpness loss whatsoever. However, I should warn you, blocking monster attacks will lead to losing sharpness quite quickly, which is why we're preferring to evade attacks and thus gone for the evade window skill. And finally, you also have the Fatalis Legend Inheritance, which raises the skill cap on numerous skills. For this build, it increases the Agitator and Artillery skills. But there we have it, that's the best of the best Master's Touch build for the Charge Blade. Like I said, it is a little bit of a niche build, and it's one for players who hate to have to manage their sharpness gauge. But despite that, it still has numerous pros and cons. For its pros, its biggest pro is its high affinity. Having maxed out Critical Eye combined with Weakness Exploit and level 7 Agitator, it means that we're going to have 100% affinity for the majority of a hunt, so long as we're attacking monster weak points. Which moves us on to our next pro, which is this build has pretty much next to no sharpness loss. As we'll be critting a monster pretty much all the time, Master's Touch should be applied to each hit, which means that we'll be able to keep that purple sharpness for pretty much the majority of a hunt. And then finally for the pros, is again, this build has a fair few quality of life skills. From evade window to health boost and more, this will all make a hunt feel a little bit more easier than it is. But unfortunately all builds have cons. When it comes to this build, its biggest con is unfortunately it's a little bit risky when it comes to blocking attacks. This is because should you block an attack with the Charge Blade, it will reduce your sharpness, meaning that you'll quickly dip into wipe sharpness and thus have reduced DPS. And the other con is, again, unfortunately this build has quite a few rare jewels, so it's not easily accessible to new players. But regardless, if you're a player who hates to have to manage their sharpness gauge and you really like the Master's Touch set bonus, then this build is for you. It has strong DPS output and should be able to take down monsters quite effectively regardless of their elemental resistances as well. If they are weak to the blast element as well, even better, as this build will perform even more effectively. Which brings us on to our fourth and final build, which is the best of the best Charge Blade Guiding Lands build. This is an updated build to take into the Guiding Lands, allowing you to farm the area as effectively as possible. When it comes to the best of the best Guiding Lands Charge Blade build, we've gone for a raw attack build, so it will bear many similarities to the first build featured in this video. So, for this you'll need the Dragon Head Beta, the Dragon Hide Beta, the Dracodean Braces Alpha, the Dragon Barbs Beta, and the Dragon Feet Beta. I've then gone for a Challenger Charm 5, and for my weapon, again I'm using the True Fatalis Charger. This has a health regen augmentation and attack increase augmentation. As for the specialist tools, I've gone for a Temporal and Rocksteady Mantle as always. So when it comes to the jewels, you've got a ton to play around with. Most of these are very similar to what we featured in the first build, although there are a few slight changes. So first of all, we've gone for an Iron War Jewel for the guard skill, Expert Jewel for some critical eye, a Hard Geology Jewel for the Geologist skill, Destroyer Jewels for the Part Breaker skill, Protection Jewels for the Divine Blessing, Charger Jewels for focus, Evasion Jewels for the Evade Window skill, Magazine Jewel for capacity boost, a Shield Jewel for the Guard Up skill, Tenderizer Jewels for weakness exploit, Artillery Jewels for the Artillery skill, Attack Jewels for the Attack Boost skill, a Sated Jewel for the Free Meal skill, and a Fortitude Jewel for the Fortify skill. As for the jewels on the mantles, I've gone for Iron War Jewels to increase the Guard skill a little bit. So if you've done what I've done here, you'll have a build with 200 health and 200 stamina, regardless of if you're taking your various consumables. You have a raw attack of 1339 with purple sharpness. You have 0% affinity, which can be 70% when you take into account weakness exploit and the agitator buff. You have a dragon rating of 1050 with high elder seal, and you have impact files. When it comes to your defense, you have a strong defense of 1111 that is strong against water and thunder, but weak to the other elements, especially dragon. Now when it comes to the skills, first of all you have Agitator at level 7, you then have Artillery at level 5, Evade Window at level 5, Divine Blessing at level 5, Attack Boost only at level 4 this time. This is because we've had to invest points into other skills such as Part Breaker and Geologist. You have Stun Resistance level 3, Critical Eye level 3, Weakness Exploit level 3, Focus level 3, Part Breaker at level 3, which is an essential skill for the Guiding Lands. Part Breaker is a skill that allows us to break monster body parts more easily, and when applied to builds that you use in the Guiding Lands, it allows us to knock monster materials off the monsters more easily. You'll also have Geologist at level 3, which to be honest we only needed it at level 1, but given the actual sockets we had in this build, we might as well go for Geologist at level 3. This is a skill when used in the Guiding Lands that allows us to pick up monster materials twice instead of once, at least from the higher tier monsters. This also means that if we go to the bone piles and mining nodes found around the Guiding Lands, it means that we can yield additional materials from them. Anyway, next up is Fortify at level 1. You'll then have Capacity Boost level 1, Guard level 1, which can be potentially level 3 when we're wearing our mantles, you have Free Meal level 1, and then Guard up level 1. Finally, for the set bonuses, you'll have the Fatalis Legend, Inheritance, and Transcendence. So there we have it. That is the best of the best build I recommend for taking into the Guiding Lands with the Charge Blade. But, of course, even this build has pros and cons. When it comes to the pros, its biggest pro is its damage output. Its raw attack skills combined with affinity based skills and artillery skills means that you're able to take on monsters quite effectively and quite quickly regardless of their elemental or element resistances. On top of that, the next pro is this build's ability to farm the Guiding Lands. Combining the Guiding Land skills such as Part Breaker, Geologist and more, it means that you're able to easily break off monster materials from monsters as well as farm the various mining nodes and bone piles efficiently and effectively. And then finally, when it comes to the pros, is the Fatalis Legend set bonus, providing you with set bonuses that increase your DPS, defensive skills, and obviously quality of life. But unfortunately there are cons. The biggest con for this build is unfortunately sharpness could be an issue, as you can drop from purple sharpness easily into white sharpness or below, especially if you're blocking attacks. And once again, as this is a best of the best build, it means that it uses some of the rarest jewels in the game, which means that it's not going to be easily accessible for new players. But regardless, if you're looking for one of the best builds for the Charge Blade to take into the Guiding Lands, this is one I'd recommend. It can pretty much farm any monster without you having to go back to camp and change up your set. You can just pretty much use this and take on any monster you come across in the Guiding Lands. So there we have it, those are the best of the best builds for the Charge Blade. Now these builds are aimed to be strong general builds, able to take on pretty much any task in Monster Hunter World Iceborne. These builds may also be slightly different than some of the other meta builds out there in the community, but regardless, these are the strongest builds that I personally like to use in the game, and I hope they will help you in your hunts. So until next time, I've been Darcblade, bringing you the best of the best builds for the Charge Blade in Monster Hunter World Iceborne. Hope you enjoyed the video, thanks for watching, subscribe and like for more.